That summer carried a kind of stillness that pressed against my skin. Heavy and unrelenting. The walls of the house seemed to absorb every sigh, every pause, every word that wasn't spoken. Even the air felt like it was waiting for something to happen, for someone to come home, for the silence to finally break. George had been gone more often than not, his job taking him to cities I never visited, places I only knew by the names printed on his flight itineraries. He'd call late at night from quiet hotel rooms, his voice distant, the hum of air conditioning in the background. "Just one more meeting," he'd say. "I'll be back before the weekend." But the weekends came and went, and so did the excuses. I stopped asking when there was a time when I used to count the hours until his return, when I'd cook his favorite meals and leave the porch light on, waiting for his car to pull into the driveway. That was years ago. Somewhere along the line, we stopped waiting for each other. The routines replaced the romance, and what was left between us felt more like obligation than partnership. We still smiled when necessary, played our parts at dinners with friends, exchanged polite goodnights before turning off the lights, but it was all performance. Behind closed doors, the silence was louder than any argument we could have had. In that silence, I began to drift through my days like a ghost. I went to work, ran errands, made coffee, watered plants that didn't need watering. The television murmured for company, and sometimes I'd leave music playing just to keep from hearing the emptiness. I would sit by the window and watch the neighborhood move on, with its life children biking down the street, couples walking dogs, laughter echoing faintly through the air, and wonder when mine had stopped feeling like it was worth living in. Then, one warm afternoon, Liam arrived. He stepped out of the car with a shy smile, suitcase in hand, and a kind of cautious energy that reminded me of summers long gone. George's son from his first marriage, 21, polite, uncertain about the world and his place in it. I hadn't seen him in years, only heard stories filtered through George's offhand mentions and Christmas photos that came in the mail. When he hugged me hello, he smelled faintly of soap and airport air, and I felt a flicker of something that I couldn't quite name. He was only supposed to stay a few weeks while figuring out college plans and job prospects. But his presence changed the atmosphere immediately. There was movement again, footsteps on the stairs, laughter from the kitchen, a new voice filling the quiet spaces. He was easy to talk to, thoughtful in small ways that surprised me. The house didn't feel as empty when he was in it. For the first time in a long while, the evenings didn't stretch endlessly ahead. I didn't realize it then, but that summer the quiet, the distance, the loneliness was already shifting, quietly rearranging itself around what was to come. The first few days after Liam arrived passed easily, almost effortlessly. He was polite, grateful, eager to help, and his presence brought a lightness to the house I hadn't realized was missing. He offered to cook breakfast, insisted on doing the dishes, and made small talk that didn't feel forced. We fell into a rhythm, the kind of domestic routine that felt warm in its simplicity. I'd brew coffee in the mornings while he tied his running shoes by the door, and sometimes we'd jog together along the quiet suburban streets. I hadn't run in years, but it felt good to move, to breathe in air that didn't feel so stagnant. Afterward, we'd sit on the porch steps, talking about nothing and everything: the weather, his plans for college, books he liked. He had an easy way of listening, one that made you feel like every word mattered. Evenings were softer too. I'd make dinner, and we'd eat while watching something old and familiar on TV. He laughed easily, full and genuine, and I caught myself smiling in response, surprised by the sound of my own laughter. It was harmless. I told myself just companionship, a way to fill the quiet. There was no reason to question it. But then one night, everything shifted, so subtly I almost didn't notice at first. George called late as usual. His voice was thin, muffled by distance, And when he said he'd be gone another week, I didn't even bother asking why. I hung up, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on the couch, the silence stretching around me. The clock ticked steadily, the sound almost taunting. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Liam appeared, his hair damp from the shower, wearing grey sweats and a plain t-shirt. There was something different about him that night. Something quiet but charged. He sat across from me, resting his elbows on his knees, watching me in a way that made the room feel smaller. "You look lonely," he said softly. His tone wasn't teasing, it was gentle, almost concerned. I smiled faintly, trying to brush it off. "Just tired," I said, taking another sip of wine. But he didn't look away. His gaze lingered, steady and unflinching. The air felt heavier, the kind of silence that hums just before a storm. I could feel his attention in every heartbeat, as if he was studying not just what I said, but everything I wasn't saying. After a long pause, he spoke again. "I don't think George deserves you." The words hung there, sharp and impossible to ignore. My breath caught before I could stop it. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. So I looked away, pretending I hadn't heard him right. But the truth was, I had. Something inside me stirred a mix of anger, confusion, and something dangerously close to longing. It wasn't what he said that unsettled me. It was that, for the first time in years, someone had really seen me. That night stretched longer than any I could remember. After his words, those quiet, trembling words, I should have ended the conversation, should have stood up, said something sensible, and gone to bed. But instead, I stayed. Something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, made it impossible to move. I told myself we were just talking, that it was harmless. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The air between us had changed. It pulsed with something unnamed, something both thrilling and terrifying. We talked for hours, the conversation wandering from light topics to the kind that leave your chest feeling raw. He told me about his childhood, about how it always felt like he was living in someone else's shadow. His mother's expectations, his father's absence, the endless comparisons to people who seemed more certain, more complete. His honesty startled me. He wasn't guarded the way most people are. There was a vulnerability in him I didn't expect, a kind of searching that reminded me of myself. When I spoke, it felt like confession. I told him about the loneliness that lived in me like a second skin, about how my marriage had dissolved not through fights or betrayal, but through slow neglect. How George and I had become polite strangers orbiting around the same life. I admitted how I sometimes couldn't remember the last time I felt seen, really seen, by anyone. My voice trembled as I spoke, but Liam didn't interrupt. He listened, eyes steady on mine, and in that gaze I felt the dangerous comfort of being understood. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The glow from the lamp dimmed, and the night outside deepened into silence. At one point, he reached out, just a small gesture, his fingers brushing mine where they rested on the couch. It was barely a touch, but it felt like the ground shifted beneath us. I should have pulled away. I didn't. Instead, I let his hand linger there, warm and certain against my skin. He said my name softly, almost a whisper, like it was something sacred. The sound of it caught me off guard. For years, George had said my name with indifference, routine, habit. But when Liam spoke it, there was something else there. Curiosity, tenderness, maybe even desire. It made my heart ache with the memory of what it used to mean to be wanted. When he leaned closer, I didn't move. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the rhythm of breath and the trembling closeness of what was about to happen. When his lips met mine, every instinct screamed that it was wrong. But the ache of being desired drowned out reason. It wasn't love, at least not the kind I once believed in, but it felt like being woken after years of sleep. When dawn came, the guilt arrived with it, harsh and unforgiving. I couldn't meet his eyes. I told myself it had been a mistake, one night of weakness, a moment I would bury deep. But as sunlight crept across the floor, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The days that followed blurred together, each one heavy with the weight of what had happened and the silence that followed it. I tried to pretend nothing had changed, that the house was still the same, that I was still the same. But every corner of that place seemed to hum with the memory of that night. The living room, the couch, even the faint trace of his cologne lingering in the air. I told myself it would fade, that we could quietly move past it, that it had been one reckless mistake born of loneliness and nothing more. But pretending proved harder than I thought. Liam didn't seem ashamed. If anything, he seemed more certain, more intent on being near me. He moved through the house with a new kind of confidence, watching me the way someone watches the answer to a question they already know. When we crossed paths in the kitchen, he would brush past me just close enough for his arm to graze mine. It was subtle but electric. When I went to do laundry, I'd find small notes slipped into the pockets of my sweater's small words, barely more than whispers on paper. I can't stop thinking about you. I know you feel it too. I'd read them with my heart hammering and tear them up, but later, in the quiet of night, I'd find myself remembering every word. I started avoiding him, or at least trying to. I made excuses to stay busy, filled the house with noise music, television, anything that drowned out thought. But it didn't stop the awareness that followed me everywhere. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs made my pulse quicken. The brush of his sleeve could undo an entire day's worth of resolve. I hated it. I needed it. One afternoon, I came home early from errands and found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, sunlight catching in his hair. He looked up, startled at first, then smiled faintly, as if he'd been waiting for me. There was no hesitation in his eyes. "Don't you feel alive with me?" he asked quietly, his voice almost pleading. The words hung between us, and I didn't answer right away, because I didn't trust what might come out. The truth was lodged deep inside, and admitting it would make it real. Finally, I whispered, "That's not the point." But he smiled, as if he knew better. That night, I lay awake long after he'd gone upstairs, staring at the ceiling, feeling the war inside me. I told myself I was older, wiser, that I knew better. Yet every thought of him came like a spark in the dark, and I couldn't put out the fire it started, though it wasn't love, not the quiet, steady kind I'd once believed in. It was something raw, consuming, the kind of hunger that made you forget who you were. And in that dangerous pull, I saw myself reflected in his eyes, both of us searching for something to fill the emptiness, both too far gone to turn back. Looking back now, I can trace every step that led me here, every fragile moment that tipped the balance a little further. It didn't happen all at once. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread, in the quiet spaces between what was right and what was needed. The mornings became careful routines, coffee cups placed too close together on the counter, glances exchanged in passing that lasted a heartbeat too long. I would catch my reflection in the kitchen window and barely recognize the woman looking back. Her face was the same, but her eyes had changed. There was something restless there, something that wanted and feared in equal measure. I told myself we could still fix it, that we could draw the line again and step back into normalcy. George called from another hotel room, talking about meetings, about how things would settle down soon. His voice sounded distant, rehearsed. I murmured replies that didn't mean anything and hung up before my guilt could spill into words. He didn't hear the silence that followed. He never did. Liam, though, heard everything. He seemed to know when I was trying to keep my distance, when the guilt grew heavy enough to make me want to disappear. He'd find ways to pull me back, a question, a look, a brush of his hand against mine. Every time I told myself it would be the last. And every time, it wasn't. What terrified me most wasn't that I couldn't stop him. It was that I didn't want to. One evening, a storm rolled in. Rain pressed against the windows and thunder echoed through the walls. The air felt thick, charged. I sat by the window, watching the flashes of light across the sky, and I felt that familiar ache, the one that lived in the space between loneliness and desire. When I turned, he was standing behind me. I didn't ask how long he'd been there. He didn't speak, just reached for me like someone reaching for the only thing keeping them from falling. I wanted to resist, to end it, but instead, I let myself fall again. The world outside disappeared, replaced by breath, warmth, and the unbearable truth that this, whatever this was, had taken root too deep to be undone. Afterward, when the storm finally broke into silence, the weight of what we'd done pressed down harder than ever. I knew it couldn't last. Secrets like ours don't stay buried forever. They grow, twist, and eventually find the light. Maybe one day George will find out. Maybe the truth will shatter everything we built, fragile as it already was. I tell myself I'm prepared for that, but I'm not sure anyone ever really is. Even now, I carry that night with me, a living memory I can't wash away. It exists somewhere between guilt and longing, between ruin and relief. Liam wanted more. So did I. And though I know how wrong it was, how dangerous, part of me still remembers the way it felt to be alive in his arms, if only for a moment that was never meant to last.